The 19th Amendment granted all citizens the right to vote no matter what gender they are. The 19th Amendment is just as important today as it was years ago, because while many women today cherish their right to vote, many do not realize how miraculous it is. It took women over a century to gain the right to vote in 1920. Now, looking back almost a century later, women in America are some of the most active members of the political sphere. This image was taken from the primary source that is entitled Indictment for Illegal Voting. It was copied and produced on January 24th in 1873. This is one of the many federal court cases that shows how women were arrested for illegally voting in the 1872 voting in Rochester. The women were charged with wrongfully and unlawfully voting for candidates. The history behind this primary source deeply shows the struggles and repercussions that these women went through for voting. It also shows the strength and bravery that these women had. This court case proves that they were willing to risk anything in order to get equal rights for themselves and for other women. This primary source number 2 is taken from Susan B. Anthony's trial. Susan B. Anthony was one of the most famous American social reformer and women's rights activists who played a pivotal role in the women's suffrage movement. This preface source was an account of the proceedings on the trial of Susan B. Anthony on the charge of illegal voting at the presidential election in November of 1872. It was also on the trial of Beverly W. Jones, Edwin T. Marsh, and William B. Hall. This source proves that Susan B. Anthony was a fighter, and without her, the world would be such a different place today, and women may not have had the opportunity to feel seen and heard. The charge of Susan B. Anthony was a risk she took in order to stand up for what she believed in. This primary source is entitled the NWPA, which stands for National Women's Party Activist. The National Women's Party was an outgrowth of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which had been formed in 1913 by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns to fight for women's suffrage. In this image, you can see Alice Paul, who is an American suffragist and feminist, sew a star onto the National Women's Party ratification flag in order to represent and celebrate another state's ratification of the 19th Amendment. This image was taken and released in 1920, and it shows when the suffrage was coming to an end. It also shows some type of resolution to women's struggles when it came to a ballot. For the last primary source, I chose the front page of the Washington Herald paper from back in 1919 on June 5th. It talks about how the women suffragists were successful and victorious in the Senate. There are parts of the paper titled, "Women May Vote in the 1920 Election," and also, "Suffrage Worker on Tour of States Planning Ratification Campaign." This was a triumphant paper talking about how women suffragists had finally won the long-going battle of voting rights. This specific source is important because of how it changed history. This paper represents all of the hard work, blood, sweat, and tears women went through to simply have the right to vote. It's important to read and remember because this was the day everything changed.